Greetings, my dear viewer. You're on the channel The Price of Cheating. The channel is for those who appreciate traditional family values and condemn adultery. So be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. If only the weather had been kinder, things might have turned out differently. And if it hadn't been raining, we could have gone outside after Sunday lunch to get some fresh air. Instead, my married daughter found herself bored, her thoughts drifting into fantasies of winning the lottery jackpot. What would we do with all that money? She mused, her eyes sparkling with excitement. My son immediately jumped into the conversation, eagerly listing sleek and powerful cars he would love to drive. But first, his partner said, we need to think about finding a decent house. As the discussion continued, my daughter started dreaming about her young son's adventures in the world, imagining him exploring before he would be confined within school walls. Meanwhile, her husband suggested a more practical approach, investing the money in a workshop to turn his passion for woodworking into a thriving business. Withdrawing from the lively debates unfolding around me, I sat immersed in my newspaper. I had little interest in what my wife might contribute to this whimsical discussion. Why? Well, earlier that day, when I had stepped into the kitchen to help with lunch, she accidentally knocked a cup off the counter, shattering it on the floor. I was to blame for that mishap. I knew it was foolish to leave it there, but I was too exhausted to get into another argument, so I sought refuge in my own activities, preferring solitude to the stormy atmosphere. And when she began to paint a picture of a charming countryside cottage we supposedly would buy, I tuned out. "How lovely that sounds, Mom," Susan chimed in enthusiastically. "Isn't it, Dad?" I looked up, puzzled. "Sorry, what did you say?" My wife's gaze pierced through me, disbelief written all over her face. "Didn't you hear?" My look could have cut glass. After all, if you really want to get someone's attention, doesn't it make sense to call them by name first? Or at least ask your question in a way that doesn't make them feel like a fool. But maybe that's too mature for her taste. Our son Jack, sensing the tension, asked, "Dad, how would you spend your winnings?" With a sigh, I tried to dismiss the topic. Honestly, I try not to think about it. Before I could finish, Tricia, my wife, who could easily be mistaken for a hurricane in a tailored suit, cut in. "I'm sure he'll come up with some grand plan. You know him," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. With one sharp remark, she summed up our 50 years of marriage. I didn't miss the irony. Though in the past, she had listed an entire catalog of my flaws, she couldn't even pinpoint the one that annoyed her at that moment. Were she a paragon of perfection, I might have understood her frustration, but any hint of criticism directed at her would lead to weeks of icy silence and simmering resentment. Our daughter Susan clearly regretted bringing up the topic and tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but Tricia was relentless, her smirk growing wider. "Maybe you've already thought about it," she teased, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "And what do you plan to buy?" Things weren't always this way. Once, love between us flowed easily and naturally. Side by side, we navigated the chaos of parenting, raising our children as a united front. But over time, as Susan entered her teenage years, something changed. Tricia developed a lack of respect for me, not absolute, but enough to weaken my attachment to her with each passing instance. When we turned 60, I found myself in a state of apathy. I felt hurt because her words affected me deeply, simply because I had mentally distanced myself from her. I remained in the marriage not out of love, but for convenience. I mentioned a figure, £2 million, which I could spend at my discretion. I glanced at Susan, then at Tricia. Perhaps my daughter sensed the tension in the air and realized that her mother's reaction was overly emotional. "Unfortunately, I don't want to endure this anymore," she pleaded. After all, it was my idea, and even I could see it was getting out of control. It seemed that others in the room shared her feelings, but Tricia was determined, unwilling to abandon her plan. "So let's hear Mr. Dreamer's ideas," she shot back. Setting the newspaper aside, I leaned back in my chair and let my thoughts wander. I would buy a charming cottage in a sunny place, maybe in Italy, not far from an airport so I could easily visit the children. She shifted her expression from irritated to puzzled. This wasn't the fairy tale she had imagined. The atmosphere in the room grew tense as I continued speaking, my words hanging in the air like a thin whisper. Perhaps, if luck smiles upon me, I'll find a widow or a divorcee in this quaint village. Maybe I'll turn to one of them for advice on cooking with the fresh produce of the region. My British accent and charming awkwardness might win her over, and we'd find ourselves in a room together, with tangled sheets and shared secrets. I dreamed that our first meeting would be a whirlwind of desire, our bodies entwined on the kitchen table, laughter mixed with passionate ardor. Afterward, we'd retreat to bed where passion reigned, and I finally felt the closeness of someone who truly desired me. Looking at my family, I gauged their reactions, ensuring they caught my not-so-subtle hints. In this fantasy, 6 months later, I'd file for divorce, ready to begin a new chapter of freedom. Have you heard about the change in the law in September? You no longer need to justify it, you just need to declare that you're ready to move on. After 6 long months of living apart, it all ended. Let's make a deal. I'll cover all the £1,000 of the divorce cost myself from my winnings. You won't bear any expenses. You see, I dreamed of a different old age, and now, at 70, I've decided to divorce you, Trisha. I know that 10 years ago, you cheated on me. You didn't even have the decency to do it outside our home. I kept this secret for a long time, but now, when you treat me like a doormat in front of our children and grandchildren, it's over. I won't tolerate such disrespect anymore. I leaned back in the chair, the newspaper trembling in my hands. You know, I have my dreams too. I had waited for this moment. I wanted to expose the true nature of Trisha in front of the children. I dreamed that they would finally understand who their mother really was. This concludes the story. If you like it, then put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.